My name is Adam Singerman. I'm a rising sixth-year PhD student in the linguistics department here at the University of Chicago. I'm here today with Professor Lenore Grenoble, who is our department chair and one of the co-chairs on my dissertation committee. And she's a very popular instructor and researcher within the department. And we're here today in honor of her having been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And Lenore, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Adam, for interviewing me.
Well, it's my pleasure. So let me ask, you're known today especially well for your work on endangered languages, but that's not what your graduate school training was in, right? You were trained in Slavic linguistics?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
So, well, I think I'm a child of the Cold War. So I grew up in a time of the Cold War and got interested in languages and linguistics, but started focusing on Russian and then learned Serbo-Croatian and then Polish and wrote a dissertation on Russian and Polish, actually.
What did you focus on in particular in the dissertation?
If
you remember, if you haven't blocked it out yet.
Wasn't that traumatic.
Okay.
I was looking at a particular kind of verbal aspect in Russian and Polish verbs. Slavic verbs have this subset of verbs, verbs of motion, that do strange things, marking whether you're traveling in a round trip or towards a single goal or repeatedly if you're in process, and those are actually different in Russian and Polish even though they came from a common system. So I was interested in aspect, verbal categories, and spatial relations. So that came together in the dissertation.
And at what point after your dissertation did you start to transition to the study of Siberian languages and endangered languages?
You know, when I was coming up for tenure, I decided that if I got tenure, I would want to do something that also had some social value to it and put my knowledge of Russian and Russia to use. So I came up for tenure in 1995. I got tenure, which was shortly after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I felt it would be really good to look at endangered languages, which is it's a big social issue, and to look at them within the context of the former Soviet Union, since I could negotiate my way around the former Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet government, I could travel to places that were really impossible to go to for Americans before. So that was actually the turning point.
So what kind of places were impossible to go to for Americans before?
Well, to go anywhere in the Soviet Union, you needed to have a visa to a particular location, and you're written into that location. So even traveling between Moscow and Leningrad was impossible without a visa for both places. So going to villages in Siberia was virtually impossible. The Caucasus, you could go to major cities like Tbilisi, but to go out into the villages was very, very difficult, if not impossible.
So what was the first native Siberian language that you worked on?
I started working on Venky in the late 1990s. Venky is a Tungusic language spoken in Siberia by reindeer herders. The Venky are distantly related to the Manchu, which would be the only other Tungusic language that most people would have heard of.
Some people. I don't know if most people have heard of Manchu, but
I think Manchu's pretty well known, but Venky's not. Venky are scattered throughout Siberia because as reindeer herders they move around a lot. They've moved around more than any other indigenous group, and so they live in very small communities, and the language was, well, probably in better shape in the 1990s. It was probably in worse shape than we thought in the 1990s. The official statistics, I think, had it with 18,000 speakers, but there's less than 5,000 speakers of Venky today.
And what's the intergenerational picture like? Are there children learning the language?
There are still children learning the languages. The people who've maintained a traditional lifestyle live with reindeer herds, and they are herding and hunting pretty much all year. So if the children of those families learn Venky as a first language, but when they move into the towns or go to school, they start to learn Russian. But there's still children learning the language, and there's some revitalization efforts. So there are some children, but it's not in great shape.
So what kind of scholarship have you pursued in relation to Venky? What kind of research have you done?
So I've done a lot actually with spatial relations in Venky and looking at some of the dialect distribution for just basic marking of basic categories like plurals are unusual in Venky and seem to vary with the dialects. The dialects are widespread since they cover a huge amount of territory. in Siberia, and I have done a lot of work on the influence of Russian, since speakers are by and large bilingual, and many now speak Russian better than Venky, so to look at what's happening in the changes of the structure of the language, things like code switching and some discourse analysis.
Just out of curiosity, in the villages which are pursuing the most traditional lifestyle, still engaged in reindeer herding, is everyone bilingual in Russian there? Okay.
Nowadays, absolutely everyone is bilingual. When I first went to Siberia in the late 1990s, you could find people of the older generation who spoke a little bit of Russian, but not a lot. But right now, everybody really is bilingual.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another Arctic language that you've worked on is West Greenlandic. Can you tell us about that and how you got involved in the dictionary project?
So I started working in West Greenland. I was looking for a different place outside of Siberia, and was working and have been working since 2007 with a colleague at Dartmouth College who was an ecosystems ecologist. And we were looking for a place where interesting things were going on in the ecosystem, and also there were people who would be interesting for me to work with. So Greenland matches that. Climate change is accelerated in the Arctic, and Greenland has an indigenous population, like 88% is Inuit. So a very interesting language and very interesting climate change going on.
Can you tell us about the dictionary project?
So the way Greenland is organized, language is regulated by the Greenland Language Secretariat, which is part of the government of Greenland. And so in order to work with people there, I could just do independent research, but I really wanted to be collaborative and do something that would be useful to the Greenlanders. So I started working with the Greenland Language Secretariat, and the head of the Secretariat said that what he felt was really needed was an English Greenlandic, or English Kalaallisut is the name of the language in the language, a dictionary. And that project started a number of years ago. We are just this summer publishing a digital version of the dictionary. It's a tricky thing because words are not formed the same in English and in Kalaallisut. But that was a project that they essentially assigned to me. So I built a team up to work on that.
Can you tell us a little bit in an accessible way about how words are built in Greenlandic?
So, whereas in English we have things that are clearly words with an identifiable meaning per word, in Greenlandic you take a word and you can add multiple endings onto the word, and those endings convey things that they're suffixes, so they can't be pronounced separately. They add the kind of information that is often conveyed in separate words in English, with the result being that a single word in Greenlandic can be very, very long and usually translates into a sentence in English. So just as we can make an infinite number of sentences, we can actually make an infinite number of words in Greenlandic. So one of the theoretical questions is what words are so conventionalized that they need to be in a dictionary so that you can look them up, versus which words are just things that people make on the fly.
Have you been working with anyone else at UChicago on that project?
Yes, this project has heavily engaged Jerry Sadek, whose work with Greenlandic goes way back to the 1970s, when the man who was the head of the language secretariat when I started working in Greenland, Carl Christian Olsen, or Puyu, as everyone calls him, Puyu, was actually a student here at the University of Chicago and got Jerry interested in Greenlandic. So he's been working on Greenlandic for over 40 years, and he's done a lot of the heavy lifting in making the dictionary.
Okay.
And then the project has also engaged a couple of undergraduate students who are both now graduate students, TJ Hines and Perry Wong, Caitlin Hogan, who's now an undergraduate student, and Hillary McMahon, a graduate student. So pretty good team from Chicago.
Cool. And how did you end up working on West African languages too? Because that seems to not fit the overall theme of you like to live and stay in cold places. So New Hampshire, then Illinois, and also Siberia and Greenland are climate-wise not so similar to Cameroon and Senegal.
That's right.
Okay.
And in general, I do like to live in cold places. I think that it's kind of interesting as I look back on the intellectual path that I followed, even specializing in Russian. I could have specialized in a South Slavic language, but I actually like Russian. I do like cold places, and I like the cold. I like the culture in cold places. But I started working in Senegal because my daughter was a Peace Corps officer and stationed in Senegal, and she learned, this Peace Corps teaches you the local language, and so she learned Wolof. And so one of the classes I teach here, as you know, is the field methods class, and that year we decided to do Wolof as the field methods language, so I could just talk to her anyways.
Can you tell the viewers what a field methods class is like?
So a field methods class is a huge amount of fun. I'm doing one right now at the time of this recording on Greenlandic, on Kalaallisut, to bring in a speaker of a language that is very foreign, that none of the students know, and we strongly prefer not an Indo-European language, so something that's quite different from English. And the job is to teach the students to learn the grammar from the speaker alone, without using any materials, any written materials. So you learn how to get the sound system and the grammar and the lexicon down just by working with the speaker as your only resource. So it's really a linguistics class, I would say, of the best kind, because it brings together all of the skills that you need as a linguist, and it teaches you to work with people. So in that field methods class, we had a speaker from Chicago who's a Wolof speaker from Dakar, who came into class, and the students worked to learn Wolof from him and get really to describe the grammar. It's not the same as a language class. You can walk out of a field methods class and not be able to hold a conversation even though you've described the grammar pretty fully. So I had not really intended to do any research in Senegal because, as you've said, I like cold places, but I went to visit my daughter, when she was there, and I noticed that the Wolof speakers were doing something very unexpected and very interesting. They were using clicks instead of words. So instead of saying yes or wow, they would say, and I was very surprised by this, and so I thought, well, this is an interesting topic to pursue. So I started following that topic. I was really following the data, and I had a couple of graduate students involved in that one, got excited about that, came back, wrote that up. And as I was working on that, I saw a colleague from Cameroon who invited me to come to Cameroon, and it was, so I decided to do it for fun. Just following the data and following the people. And that actually turned out to be, that's Emmanuel Nguyen from the University of Yaoundé 1, and a place called CEERES, which looks at African languages. And he invited me, took a student, and actually my daughter, who turns out to be a really good field linguist. She does economics, but she's good at interviewing people, so we brought her, and she's really good in Africa. And looked for these kinds of clicks and funny sounds in the Cameroonian languages. So I was following.
Did you find any?
We found a lot, and we found some very interesting other sounds. So one thing that seems to be Pan-African is this, which means I don't like, Jiptu or Chamla in Bassa. It's called Chamla, meaning I don't like.
And did you find that same verbal gesture at work in Wolof?
Yes. So
Okay.
that's it. So in Wolof, it's called Jiptu. It seems to be Pan-African, and it seems to have, I'm saying seems, because one would like to keep doing more field work in Africa to get this, but Emmanuel, my Cameroonian colleague, says impressionistically, this is used throughout Africa with some variation whether or not you roll your eyes and how much you move your mouth, so you like that, really. And it has been attested in American English, and it's called cut eye and suck teeth.
So in previous descriptive work on Bassa and Wolof, were these kinds of sounds included? Because you make it sound like they're ubiquitous in speech.
My sense is that they are ubiquitous. Certainly in Wolof, they're highly conventionalized and used throughout Senegal, but they haven't been described. So my hypothesis is that they aren't described because they aren't actually part of what linguists think of as the sound system proper. They don't make up words, although in Wolof they clearly substitute for words. And yet my hypothesis is, my argument, is that as linguists we've been too narrowly defining what the language is. In order to speak fluent Wolof, you need to know these, and you need to interpret them because there's contrastive sets. So we have the yes one, but we also have a which is no. So contrastive and highly conventionalized speakers use them all over the place. context.
The only such kind of sound I can think of having run into in my own work, in Tupari, the Amazonian language I work on, speakers sometimes indicate agreement, maybe with a little bit of surprise, but agreement with a sharp through the nose.
Through the nose, oh.
And I noticed it after some time and then went back and reread an ethnography or sort of an adventure ethnography from the late 40s, and it was described in there. He talked about how the Tupari were doing it. So it seems to be maintained basically 70 years later for the same pragmatic purpose. So much so that when I started to try it in my own attempts to speak Tupari, someone said, "How did you learn how to do that? Who taught you how to do that?"
Yeah, that's, well, we do have something analogous, not identical, in Greenlandic, which came, I think, from contact with Danish, which is which means yes. So
Can you do that one more time?
It's an ingressive. So it's pan-Scandinavian, but the Swedish has a lot of rounding. It's a and there it is so ubiquitous and so well known that computer programmers are interested in how to mark this in a corpus of spoken Swedish. In Danish and Norwegian, there's less lip rounding, and it's spread to Greenlandic. It's also in the Faroe Islands and actually in the Shetland Islands through contact. So you can also say yes or yes or op. Op is the word in Greenlandic. So op. Or
you sound like you're suffocating.
Yeah. Or it's just you say.
What projects are you working on right now, other than the ongoing Greenlandic dictionary and verbal gestures in African languages?
Right now I'm working on a very large project looking at the kinds of changes when languages come into contact with Russian, and I will be working in Yakutsk. So your Siberian.
Where's Yakutsk?
Yakutsk is far over in the eastern part of Russia. It is the capital of the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, and Yakutsk is the capital. Yakut, the language there, is a Turkic language, and it's at the edge of the Turkic continuum, so it's quite different. And it is the home, the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia is the home to a number of indigenous groups. And
are all of those groups speakers of Turkic languages, or
no? No. There's some Venky speakers there, but a lot of Evan, which is closely related to Venky, Yukagir, and Chukchi are there. And so I'll be looking at what happens with contact with Russian and also with the language there, Yakut or Sakha, and the social dynamics. And the project also involves a study of urbanization, since people are moving into the city of Yakutsk, away from the villages, more contact. We know that urbanization drives language shifts, so people start speaking the majority language when they're in the cities and give up their home language, but we don't actually know how that plays out on the ground. So that's the next big project. I'll be going to Yakutsk in October.
Are you excited?
Yes.
Out of curiosity, the other languages that you mentioned there, spoken there, Evan and Yukagir and Chukchi, what's the language endangerment situation for those languages?
They're all endangered. Yukagir is severely endangered with very few speakers left.
And the intergenerational transmission, or?
Probably not. Chukchi is a little bit more robust. Chukchi is spoken in, it's spoken in Chukotka, the autonomous region of Chukotka, and into Sakha. And historically, it was the lingua franca of the area. And the Chukchi were quite powerful. But now there's, it's also highly endangered. They're all highly endangered. The Evan, as I said, is closely related to Venky. The total population size is much smaller, but a higher percentage of the people still speak their language. So one question is, why are some of these groups shifting language, losing their language more quickly than others? And Evan is an interesting question. It's interesting to ask that question about them because they're holding on to it more robustly than some others.
I remember Michael Silverstein having said that certain patterns of language shift that he's seen in the Pacific Northwest in some sense correlate to local ideas of what languages are difficult, sometimes too difficult to learn, so that languages that have a reputation for being too difficult for anyone to really try and make a stab at if you're not hearing the language from childhood have shifted first or have shifted earlier. I don't know if that particular phenomenon extends to the region that you're looking at.
It certainly can account for the difference between Evenki and Evan, which are so closely related that learning one or the other isn't unless the attitudes might. But it seems to be something that the attitudes are Well, I don't really know. Ask me in a year.
Okay. Do the Evan engage in reindeer herding like the
Yes.
Venky do?
Yes, and they are further north, so that might be part of it. But that doesn't to be something with their language ideology, which is
Okay.
they're much more of an Arctic people. Venky is really far north. But
So from where I stand, far north and Arctic are kind of hard to tease apart, but you're saying that the Evan live
even further north. Yeah.
so even in areas I would enjoy less than Siberia.
That's
okay.
Yeah. They live in the very far north, so they live in what's the tundra area, whereas Venky are more in taiga. Which, if you don't know Arctic geography, but they're
I
they're
saw
much
the
further
Werner
north.
Herzog film about life on the taiga, so I assume that's
Yeah.
a little bit representative of what you're
Yeah.
talking about. It looked really cold. I work in South America. I'm an Americanist. So.
Well, and where you are in the Arctic, the temperature really varies. So Yakutsk is down as on record as being the coldest city in the world.
That sounds terrible,
It's
Lenore. Why do you do this to yourself? You already live in Chicago. Isn't that enough for you?
Chicago's pretty warm, actually. Yakutsk gets down to 50, 60 below centigrade. So, but I mean that's the extreme. It's
There are
more like
so
40,
many.
50
I just want to
below.
state for the record that I know that this is the Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, but there are lots of Amazonian languages that need to be worked on. And in case you're not keen on working in the tundra or enduring 50 to 60 degrees below centigrade, Amazonia needs more linguists.
Every place
Now
needs
that
more linguists.
now that
but
the pitch is done,
we have less bugs.
you do have less bugs.
They freeze.
That being said, some bugs are really tasty. Oh, this reminds me of a question I want to ask you. What's the most interesting stuff you've eaten over the course of your fieldwork? Are you allowed to talk about that?
But probably.
Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I can talk about that. Most interesting or tastiest?
Let's
most bizarre?
separate. I don't like to use the term bizarre because it's sort of a little Chicago-centric. But so, what foods have you gotten to taste during your fieldwork that are, say, the most distant from what you normally eat here in Chicago?
So in the Arctic regions, of course, there's not very much vegetation, and to eat, you must eat meat and fish, and you have to eat what's indigenous to the region.
There are no vegetarians in the Arctic.
There are no vegetarians in the Arctic. These languages don't have native words for vegetable or fruit. They have berries.
Okay.
And berries, and then you plan ahead and you collect the berries when they're ripe, and then it's not a problem freezing them over the winter.
I imagine the problem would be not freezing them over the winter. Okay.
So storing the berries historically has been fine, but you eat the mammals that are available. So in Greenland, that's seals and whale, muskox and reindeer.
What is muskox?
Muskox is a big land mammal that looks kind of like an American buffalo. They're large, shaggy. The wool is very, very soft and very, very warm. They're also kind of fierce if they start moving quickly. But people hunt them. They hunt them and caribou. And then in Siberia, there's reindeer, and there's something I guess it translates as elk. And there's some moose, elk. I don't know. It's bigger than caribou. And there's birds. Probably the strangest things I've eaten though are in Africa and in Cameroon, where there are, or most unusual, if you will, least likely to find in Chicago on a menu. So I think the one that takes the cake for me is the black mamba.
Oh yes, yeah. Was snake any good? I've never.
Yeah, it's bony, actually. It's surprisingly bony.
In the several years that I've worked with the Tupari, I've never heard of anyone under any circumstances eating snake. But in the ethnography from the 40s, it's reported that children then were allowed to eat snake, but it was taboo for adults. So the ethnographer, even though he was an adult at the time, tried a snake soup that some children had made.
Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine it being bony given how many vertebrae it has.
That's exactly. Well, I hadn't actually imagined that. But
Oh, well.
You're picturing it more accurately than I was. Yep, it's very bony. Yeah, and I don't think they seem to eat all kinds of snakes in Cameroon, and the children catch them. With highly poisonous ones, like the mamba, the black mamba.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
So, of the different Siberian foods that you've tried, which has been the most surprisingly tasty? I mean, because the way you described, I don't really eat meat very much, but the way you described the giant bison-like thing in Greenland, that sounds
Actually,
pretty
the
good.
muskox and the reindeer meat are fabulous. Yes.
Really?
They're very, very good, especially if cooked well. Oh, they're beautiful. Yeah.
Is seal any good?
Seal has a very, very strong flavor, and it's not something I like very much, and often you have to get used to it. It's a very oily meat.
Okay.
And if you remember that historically people use the oil to heat for their lanterns, and so some people have a hard time even Inuit have a hard time digesting it.
I did mean to ask, if I'm not mistaken, there's an Inuit dish that involves fermented bird. Have you ever had the pleasure of trying it?
I have not had that.
Okay.
I've had fermented seal blubber.
Verdict? Should we
it's like fermented things. It's on the strong side.
Okay. I mean, should we be asking the dining services at the University of Chicago to add it to their catering menu?
I'm not sure that it would sell well.
Okay. I mean, that would be an idea if we ever need to do an event here and we don't want people to eat the food, we could just get...
Unfortunately, seal products are illegal in the U.S.
That's a very good point. I would just like to state for the record that I am an animal lover and I'm not advocating hunting and eating, let alone fermenting, endangered species. Just want to put that out there.
Yeah, the seals aren't endangered. They're protected for other I actually don't know. Probably for historical reasons. It's a point of contention in Greenland, the seal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can now go a little bit back towards the topic of the interview. So where do you see your work going in the next few years in terms of Venky or Greenlandic or Wolof or the various languages you mentioned spoken in Yakutsk?
In Yakutsk.
Yakutsk. There's no vowel at the end? Excuse me, Yakutsk.
Yeah, Yakutia. Yakutia.
Yakutia is the
republic.
Got it.
I will certainly have an Arctic focus for the next 5 years or so. If I go back to Africa, it will be as a side project. Right now, I'm really looking at both the linguistic changes that happen with Arctic languages as they shift, and then the social factors and the social changes and the connection between all of that and well-being. There's a lot of research, there's increasing amount of research showing that knowing and using your indigenous language in the Arctic at least, and probably elsewhere, also some of the work is in Australia, but knowing and having the ability, access to the indigenous language has a positive effect on both mental, psychological, and physical well-being with things like, surprisingly, heart disease, blood pressure, cholesterol levels, all things lowering when you actually use it. So there's a very interconnected kind of picture of well-being that emerges from that, but the connections aren't totally clear. And that hasn't been studied in Russia at all, as far as I know. So I'll be looking at that.
That doesn't sound too surprising to me, given that when populations assimilate linguistically, they're likely to be incorporated at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in whatever urban areas they move to, and then access to healthier foods would be limited, and then so on for things like heart disease and diabetes.
It looks like, and we certainly need more studies, but it looks like in the Canadian Arctic, the studies show that even the populations that are in situ, where those people who are using the language have lower diabetes rates than those who aren't. So in the same geographical areas. So
interesting.
Yeah,
and it's not clearly correlating to things like changes in diet?
No.
Okay.
No. So it's surprising. It probably has to do with the notion. It probably has to do with an old-fashioned kind of notion, or a new wave, I don't know, of everything being interconnected and psychological well-being going hand in hand with physical well-being.
So I have one more question for you before I ask for book recommendations. What do you see the future of the field of language endangerment looking like, and sort of what would you say to students who are interested in researching endangered languages?
I think there's so much work still to be done with endangered languages and across the spectrum of questions that you could possibly ask. So documenting, as you're working on Tupari, documenting and describing the language while it's still spoken before a lot of shift happens, looking at the stages as speakers start to learn another language and replace the indigenous language. All that kind of documentation needs to be done. And then we find in these languages that are understudied all kinds of linguistic phenomena that we just didn't know about, so they are working hand in hand with linguistic theory. I think there's a huge amount of work to be done. It very much needs to be done. And I think it's going to shape how we do linguistics and linguistic theory going forward. We know the range of what we know about is possible in languages is much greater than even 10 years ago. It's also driving, or not driving, but interacting with advances in computational linguistics, because now we have new kinds of data and different kinds of data corpora that are going to help inform how we build those corpora and what kind of tools we make with them. So one thing that people don't really know about is that a lot of the work on endangered languages is used for speech processing and speech recognition, even in languages like English, because one of the things that the speech software has a hard time doing is recognizing differences in pronunciation, even among English speakers, because there's such a wide variation. Yeah. Whereas working with endangered languages that have different sound systems can help them build better tools to recognize English.
Got it.
So that's a rather unexpected bonus. But the more that we work collaboratively like this, the more we will advance across the field.
All right, so now the final question. We've covered the important things like your research and maybe the even more important things like good foods that can be found towards the North Pole. So the last question is, what books might you recommend?
So I would like to recommend, for people who are interested in the Arctic, a kind of detective novel. It's not a new one, but it's a Danish novel translated into English.
I was hoping you were going to say translated into Greenlandic.
Well, it may be in Greenland. It's Smile's Sense of Snow, but it's about a Greenlander too. And it takes place mostly in Copenhagen, but also in Greenland. It's by Peter Hoeg, H-O-E-G, and it's a really good read, and it gives you a good story that also is connected to Greenland. So I would recommend Smile's Sense of Snow.
Anything else, or is that... Do you have time to read anything else these days?
No, these days right now I'm very busy working with the Greenlanders. So no, I've been reading Greenlandic dictionaries.
Can I ask you one question?
Yes. I think it's actually really important to talk about useful knowledge with the kind of work that I do, since the language documentation and all of the field work that I do is aimed at two different audiences. One is the scholarly audience in this question of advancing linguistic theory, advancing science. But the other is what the communities need to know and what they want. And communities, by and large, don't care at all about linguistic theory. What communities care about at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day is their language. And they want resources for their language, resources that describe their languages, resources that make other languages accessible, resources that they can use if they have a revitalization project. So the dictionary project is a good example of making knowledge useful because it is something that the Greenlanders asked for. They wanted to be able to get to English through Greenlandic. The Greenlanders also learned Danish. They're still part of the Kingdom of Denmark, moving more and more towards independence, but they learned Danish. But the only way for them to learn English is through Danish. So they wanted direct access to English. That was one thing. They also wanted more people to be able to learn their language. And there are just many, many more speakers of English than Danish. That's one practical thing. Another very practical project that I did in Greenland was documenting plant knowledge. So a lot of the knowledge of the uses of indigenous plants, of native plants in Greenland, was lost under colonization. But there's some people who are reinventing it. This was the finding. People are completely fluent, so they can talk about the plants, and they might know the common name. And if they don't know the common name, they have no problem making up a common name, the way kids here, because it's a tree, or they can make up a name for a flower, but they don't know what to do with it. And so they have been recreating that knowledge, and ultimately I've been working with a former graduate student on that project. We want to publish a guide to using the plants in Greenlandic, so that's useful for the Greenlanders, and also in English, and that's useful for everybody living in the Arctic where there's access to those plants and they can get at it through English. So I think it's very, very important. With the Venky, I have published readers. So a Venky, even those who speak the language, had a written form that was created in the early Soviet period by Soviet linguists, but it never really took off as a written language. People learned Russian, and so in their literate lives. They just read and write in Russian. And yet, one of the things that people do when they want to revitalize a language is they often think about sort of traditional textbook materials. So I've made some readers for Venky, and that's a project that needs to be further developed. And I think one of the goals when we go to Yakutsk, I'm going with a graduate student, is to look and see what, if anything, people want and what kinds of materials they want. But one of the things of long-lasting value that we try to create are excellent video and audio recordings of people using the language in everyday life. When speakers go back, if they've lost their language and they go back to revitalize, they often want dictionaries. They don't really want the kinds of sentences we get in grammars. Mm-hmm. What they want is to be able to talk to their children. They want to be able to talk to their grandparents. They want to be able to live in the language. And so I'm trying very hard to document what, from the speaker's sense, will be useful language. And at the same time, that's a kind of thing that not everybody in linguistics is looking at, that daily use of language. It doesn't seem very exotic or interesting, but actually that's what language is on the ground. And so how we interact, interactional language really, how we interact, how we use language to negotiate life on a daily basis, the mundane, that will also further linguistic theory.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Esther.